There are some people who are going to face post-traumatic stress. That's, I think, the sad news.
It's the whole world versus a virus.
I would say the encouraging news psychologically is over half of people report a different response to trauma, which is post-traumatic growth.
Welcome to World versus Virus, a podcast from the World Economic Forum that aims to make sense of the COVID-19 outbreak. Every week we bring you expert advice and analysis of the global crisis and look at what might be done to fix it. Please remember to subscribe to World vs. Virus on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Robin Pomeroy. This week, a special extended interview with Adam Grant, an organisational psychologist with tips on coping in lockdown when the lines between our work and home lives are blurred. He'll also be saying what we might all learn from this experience.
There are going to be some incredible natural experiments. They're already being run. There's a whole group of organizational psychologists, sociologists, and management professors who are going to spend the next 5-10 years studying the effects of this pandemic.
He spoke to my colleague, Ross Cheney.
Dr. Adam Grant, you're an organizational psychologist. Can you tell me just a little bit about what that actually means?
Yeah, I definitely can't cure your OCD if you have it. I don't know how to organize your closet. What I do is I study how to make work better. And so that might mean redesigning jobs to make them more meaningful and motivating, trying to build cultures of creativity and generosity in teams, or even trying to make entire organizations more productive.
First and foremost, obviously, this is a global health crisis, an economic crisis. But for many millions of us, we're just battling this loss of normalcy in our daily lives. How well prepared do you think we are as human beings to deal with a situation like this? Does it play to any of our natural strengths, or is it more likely to expose our weaknesses?
Oh, I think it's a little bit of both, like everything else. I guess I sound like a social scientist right now, right? It depends, is always the answer. But I think the challenging part is, as human beings, we don't like uncertainty and unpredictability. There's even some evidence that if you're highly neurotic, you actually prefer experiencing pain over being in the dark about what you're going to experience. And I think that that's a part of the crisis that's really challenging a lot of us. On the flip side, we're highly adaptable. Darwin actually wrote when he was building his theory of evolution that one of the things that natural selection favors is a sense of flexibility. And it's not always the strongest species that survives, it's sometimes the most adaptable. So I think that we've all lived that, right? We've been through crises before. And I think one of the ways we can cope with the uncertainty is to say, look, when you can't imagine the future, when it's very difficult to know when this is going to end and how it's going to end, you can actually rewind and think more about the past. And when you do that, you can recognize hardships that you've faced before. You can learn something from the lessons of your own resilience. And then knowing, of course, this is a different kind of crisis, try to figure out, what did I do effectively before that might work for me today?
I still hear a lot of people complaining about FOMO, the fear of missing out, even though there's nothing really going on. Has COVID killed FOMO or exacerbated it, in your opinion?
Oh, I think it's, again, a little bit of both. I think there's FOMO around all the things that we could be doing but aren't, even though no one else is doing them either, right? There's a sense that, we're losing. So far, we've lost a month of quality experience out in the world. At the same time, though, I think it's a little bit easier to tolerate that sense of missing out when you know it's just not available. But I prefer to think about this less in terms of FOMO and more in terms of what's often called JOMO, which is the joy of missing out. I actually made a list of all the things I'm thrilled that I don't have to do. And that list includes changing out of sweatpants. It also includes having to commute. I definitely have gotten to avoid a lot of awkward interactions with strangers and maybe even a few awkward interactions with people I know. And I think this is actually a practice that's pretty useful for people. We have a lot of evidence that marking moments of joy can actually create those moments of joy because we're more likely to notice them, we're more likely to savor them and share them. And so being able to just capture a few things that are really joyful about getting to stay home, even though, it's not all flex time and family time, seems like a productive step.
I think for me, I'm a huge sports fan, and obviously all sport has been cancelled. I'm just trying to think about how great next year will be. Like, we're going to have an extra Olympics when there wasn't meant to be one. Is that a useful technique, focusing on future enjoyment?
Yeah, I think so. Mental time travel is a powerful skill. So we talked about rewinding. There's also value in fast forwarding and imagining all these things that we have to look forward to.
Every team has its introverts and extroverts. Do you think this crisis has leveled the playing field between them?
I wouldn't go that far. So I've been doing research on introverts and extroverts for over a decade, and I found that consistently, extroverts are stereotyped as better team members and better leaders, even though empirically that's not actually true. I found that introverts are every bit as effective as extroverts when you look not only at their leadership skills, but the actual performance, productivity, and profitability of the teams and companies that they run. I found that extroverts are stereotyped as better salespeople. They're not. Actually, the best salespeople in my data are not introverts or extroverts. They're ambiverts. What in the world is an ambivert? is the next logical question. So an ambivert is somebody who's in the middle of the spectrum between introversion and extroversion. And like most personality traits, introversion, extroversion's normally distributed. It's shaped like a bell curve. And so there are people on the extremes, but those extremes are actually much less common than people who hover in the middle. And so an ambivert is somebody who's equally comfortable being in the spotlight and maybe fading into the background a little bit, who, gravitates in some situations toward talking, other situations toward listening. And what I found in sales was that the extroverts sometimes were overbearing. They might have sold too hard. They would talk too much. They didn't listen and learn enough about what the customer really needed. And the introverts were often struggling on the other end of the spectrum, being too quiet, maybe not being assertive enough. And ambiverts had this great flexibility to say, look, there are moments when I'm going to be in introvert mode. There are moments that I'm going to be in extrovert mode. And I think the lesson for me from that was we all need to learn to unleash our inner ambiverts. I think the reality of the current situation is we're still catering to extroversion, right? So the fact that we're now sitting on Zoom calls all day and still, feeling like we're in a room with our colleagues, as opposed to saying, maybe we should have fewer meetings. Maybe we should actually, weigh in with some of our thoughts by email. We've known for a while that introverts' voices tend to get overlooked in a group setting. And so I think this would be a good time to experiment with moving towards some more independent individual work, which we know is actually the best approach if you want to generate lots of good ideas in groups. There's some evidence that individuals will generate more great ideas alone, and groups come up with more good ideas when they're together. And I think in this case, one of the simple practices I would recommend to make sure that introverts don't get drowned out is to shift from brainstorming to brainwriting. So brainwriting is a process where you take all the people in a team, let's say you have 8 people in your team, you ask them all to come up with ideas independently and then submit them into the chat function or into a Google Doc, and then you review them. And what that does is it leverages individual strengths around coming up with original ideas. And then it also allows the group to do what it does best, which is to begin to evaluate and refine. And we have a lot of evidence that brainwriting technique is actually more effective than just diving right into group brainstorming. So to me, that's one of the most, it's probably one of the simplest and one of the most effective ways to make sure that introverts are heard. I actually think that one of the equalizing forces that's in play is because people who are maybe loud or extremely confident have a slightly harder time commanding the stage right now. That could be an opportunity for people who are quieter, for people who ask more questions to speak up. But I think most of the video conference tools we have available will still immediately put the loudest person on the screen. And so one thing I'm hoping for is a shift in technology that says, let's figure out how we can redistribute the airtime to the people who have talked the least, as opposed to the people who talk the loudest.
And through this crisis, somehow managing expectations has become even harder. All of a sudden, we're workers, we're teachers, we're providers, we're cleaners. Should we even try and keep up? Is this good for our sanity?
I don't know. I think this is a time when leaders need to be flexible and compassionate. I feel like at some level, we're all that BBC dad now whose kids came dancing into his interview. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I know that there are people who are trying to maintain boundaries and get focused, but this seems like a great time for leaders to back off on FaceTime and say, look, I really don't have the option to micromanage you. So maybe I should try this other leadership technique called motivating, which starts with giving people the freedom to make choices about when they work, how they work, where they work, with whom they work. And I think this is not an experiment that any of us opted into, but as long as we're stuck with it, I'd say as a leader, it's an opportunity to say, if I impose less control over people's schedules and plans, that's going to teach me whether I can trust them or not. And the reality is we've known from a couple decades of research on management and monitoring that when people are monitored too closely, that signals distrust. And they respond by saying, look, I'm not trusted, so I don't really feel obligated to act in a way that you might consider trustworthy. Whereas when you give people a little bit of space and you allow them to make some choices, they start to feel a greater sense of loyalty, and they reciprocate the trust that they're shown. And so given that we don't have a lot of options anyway to control people, I think this is the ideal time to to do a little bit less of it.
You've talked and written a lot about what you call the givers, takers, and matchers. Can you describe what this means? And does this period of self-isolation when working remotely magnify or reduce these qualities?
Oh, that's interesting. I would love to have some data on that. I'll give you a few hypotheses. But first, so giving, taking, and matching are just different styles of interaction that we bring to the workplace. Givers are people who, by default, want to know, what can I do for you? Takers are the opposite. They're interested in figuring out, what can you do for me? And then matchers kind of hover in the middle of that spectrum, and they say, look, I don't want to be too selfish or too generous, and so I'll do something for you if you do something for me. And I think, at some level, what we're facing right now is what in psychology we'd call a weak situation rather than a strong situation. So in strong situations, norms and expectations are extremely clear, and there's a lot of structure. In weak situations, there's much more ambiguity and uncertainty, and people have a lot more freedom to express whatever their values and personality traits are. And so given that we're working remotely and a lot of us are separated in space and sometimes in time from our teams, the situation's a lot weaker. That opens the door for us to express whatever our values are. And so my guess is the takers may feel like they have a little bit more license to shirk, maybe to steal credit for other people's ideas, right? They might think that they're less likely to get caught in certain situations. I think the givers, though, we've seen an incredible outpouring of generosity in this crisis. And I think, in a lot of ways, it's brought out the better angels of people's nature, whether it's in the healthcare system with people putting their lives on the line to take care of the sick, whether it's scientists, working overtime at a scale that I think is unprecedented in human history to try to find a vaccine or, a plasma treatment that might help in the interim. And I think that the givers really see this as a situation where they need to step up. They feel a sense of responsibility to try to help. My guess, Ross, and I'm curious to hear your reaction to this, my guess is that matching actually gets sort of weeded out a little bit in these kinds of weak situations, because I don't think that most people operate like matchers because it's their core value. I don't think they're wandering around thinking about, how do I make sure that I express my fundamental guiding principles in life of keeping, track of every credit and debit. I think people match because they're afraid of the risks of overcorrecting on either side. And I think in these weak situations, people probably gravitate more toward fundamentally, at a basic level, am I more of a selfish or generous person? What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think in the sort of the microcosm of our team, we've seen that same sort of solidarity. I mean, obviously, we in our daily lives, we have different challenges. So we have people on our team who have young kids, and I don't have children. So we have to step up. We know that we have to step up and help them to keep our team going, but also because it's the human thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's quite encouraging in many ways.
I think so too. And, it makes me think a little bit, one of the big frustrations for givers in a situation like this is they don't always know where they can help. So I've had colleagues and former students reach out and say, I'd like to do something. I don't have healthcare skills or, science skills. I don't run a warehouse to get people supplies. What can I do to help and support other people? And one of the things we've been trying out recently is a couple of years ago, I co-founded a knowledge sharing platform called Givitas. And the idea was to make it easy for people to seek and give help in 5 minutes a day or less. And this platform has been deployed in some really powerful ways for people just to put requests out for what they need. And then sometimes they're in a community with their colleagues. Sometimes they're in a local community, like a university, for example, where they don't even know the other people who are part of that list. but they'll post a request, and then somebody who's excited to pitch in and contribute can see, hey, here's a problem someone else is facing, and let me see if I can, if I can try to support them. So I would love to see more of those kinds of efforts to make sure that we can make people's needs and requests visible, so that the people who have the motivation and the ability to contribute are able to direct their energy in the way it's needed.
I think for many of us, this boundary between work and life has blurred, for many people, disappeared altogether. Does work-life balance? How does it work in a crisis like this?
Oh, I think work-life balance has been a myth for a long time. The image I have in mind when I think about work-life balance is, somebody who's walking on a tightrope and feels like they're not going to fall off either side. And I just don't think that's realistic. If you care about your family and you care about your job and you also want to prioritize health and friendships and hobbies, right? The idea that you might have even a day where all those things are in perfect harmony, to me, is hysterically funny, if not just wrong. I think, though, that the balance can exist on a broader scale. So what I always strive for is balance in a week, where I might have 2 days in a given week where I'm pretty focused on my work and I don't get as much time with my family as I want. But then I'll have 2 more days where I'm in family mode and work takes a real backseat. And I think that that's probably the most realistic way to manage this crisis is to say, look, instead of work-life balance, we ought to think about work-life rhythm. To say there are going to be different parts of the song that repeat at different parts of the week. And, knowing that we're going to come back to that melody, maybe not every day, but every third or fourth day, is a way to maintain some sanity. I also think this depends a lot on whether you tend to be more of an integrator or a segmenter. So this is another spectrum of individual differences that my colleague Nancy Rothbard has studied. Integrators are people who actually like to blur the line between work and home. Or work in the rest of their lives. And so you'll see lots of pictures of their kids on their office desk. They will, frequently talk about work at the dinner table. Segmenters are much more comfortable when they can divide those lines, or when they can create a clear boundary between who they are at work and other parts of their lives. And in Nancy's data, segmenters actually have higher well-being than integrators. They're able to recharge, they're able to maintain energy, they're not as distracted. And I think this situation is probably a lot harder on segmenters than it is on integrators. I think for a lot of integrators, they're like, virtual home office tour, great. I invite my colleagues over for dinner anyway, right? And segmenters are saying, get out of my house. This is a place where I'm supposed to be with my family, not working. But I think we can all be a little bit sensitive to that, right? And say, okay, if I have colleagues who have preferences for segmentation, I should try hard if they're maintaining some boundaries around time. And they say, look, between 5 and 7:30 is family time every night. I should really try hard not to step on that, knowing if I'm an integrator, they probably need that more than I do.
I also wanted to ask you about something you mentioned in a tweet recently where you said that warnings backfire when they rob us of a sense of freedom. Does that explain why some people are not taking the rules that have been put in place seriously enough? And talking personally, had a lot of problems getting my father to stay at home. He just seemed to think these things don't apply to him. Is there something about the way that we word these, that governments and companies or experts word these warnings and this advice that is wrong?
I think so. So the first time I started thinking about this actually was in studying why people who have season tickets to the basketball team that they love often don't show up for every game. And I was working on this project years ago with a student at the time, Rachel Penny, and we decided before a big basketball game that we were going to try to motivate fans to show up. And so we sent an email to season ticket holders where we had quotes from coaches and players about how energizing it was to have a full stadium, or to make sure there weren't any empty seats in their arena. And it had no effect whatsoever on fan attendance. What did work was when we did something different, and we just asked a single question when we emailed them, which is, are you planning to attend the game? And what worked there is a question seems to bypass people's natural resistance and defense mechanisms. And it allows them to reflect on the behavior themselves and make the choice that they want to make. And I think in watching the way that people are communicating about this pandemic, a lot of well-meaning experts have given what feel to me like orders. You must stay home. Do not leave your house. It is extremely dangerous to go outside. And you can say all those things and hope that people will follow. But we've known for over half a century that a common reaction is what's called psychological reactance, which is sort of that knee-jerk, you can't tell me what to do, I'll get sick if I want to, sort of response that maybe you've seen with your father and others. And so, I think that what seems to work better when people have a strong motivation to be in charge of their own destiny and control of their own choices, is to be a little bit gentler and say, I was just curious, what are your plans for today? And, I know that you're the best person to judge what's healthy and safe for you. Here's the information I've seen. What are you thinking? And if you can reinforce that people have a sense of autonomy and freedom and control and choice, they're a lot more likely to follow through with what they think might be an effective and safe behavior. And this effect of asking questions on changing behavior has been demonstrated for a lot of different kinds of behaviors. We know that you can increase volunteering rates by just asking people, do they plan to volunteer? You can get people to eat healthier, avoid fatty foods, brush and floss their teeth, just by asking them if they're planning to do it. And so I wonder what would happen if you called your father up and said, hey, I was just wondering, are you planning to go and get covered in germs today? Or, I was curious, are you planning to go out today? Or, are you planning to try to stay safe at home? Would love to hear what you're up to.
You also tweeted recently that interruptions are part of our new reality. Are there ways to make ourselves more resilient to this?
I don't know that resilience is actually possible when it comes to interruptions. Probably one of the best things we can do is try to find a sense of self-compassion. We talked earlier about being more understanding of others who might have a lot on their plates right now. And I think we need to give that same understanding to ourselves. So when psychologists like Kristen Neff study self-compassion, they say, look, think of the kindness that you would show to a good friend who was in a situation like yours. And then what happens if you apply that same kindness to yourself? So when we get interrupted, instead of getting frustrated and then getting meta-frustrated, right? I'm frustrated that I'm frustrated and I have a whole set of emotions to manage. I can say, okay, this is a really difficult time right now. In general, interruptions are part of the human condition. They are an intensified part of the human condition during a pandemic. And I know I'm not the only one facing these. And let me just see if I can get through today without losing control. And then if I don't succeed today, I'll try again tomorrow. And when we don't beat ourselves up like that, it's a lot easier to move forward as opposed to wallowing in all the challenges we faced in the past.
And do you think like short-term goals like that are quite important right now in this particular situation?
Yeah, I think so. We know from studying burnout that one of the best predictors of engagement is not necessarily a major accomplishment. It can actually just be a small win, a sense of daily progress. And so, yeah, this is a perfect time to recalibrate goals and tell yourself, okay, what I used to accomplish in a week, there are times when I feel like I can't pull that off in a day right now. And so if I lower my expectations, I'm going to feel like I'm making more of a dent. I'm going to beat myself up less, and I'm probably then going to find some momentum.
Okay, so obviously this crisis will come to an end. Do you think there's anything positive that may come out of it? Or rather, is there anything that you would like to keep when things return to normal?
Yeah, I do think we're going to see a lot of employers embrace more flexibility around working from home and having virtual teams. I think they're going to find out that it wasn't as impossible as they thought it was. And they're going to see there are some productivity gains that come from not having to commute and getting to work where you want. My read of the meta-analytic evidence, the studies of studies, suggest that as long as people are in the office a few days a week, working from home 1 or 2 days a week does not hurt their satisfaction, their performance, their productivity. So I think that's one good thing that's going to come out of it. On an individual level, I think unfortunately, there are some people who are going to face post-traumatic stress. If you look at data on trauma, about 15% of people, according to most estimates, will come out of trauma with some kind of PTSD. That's, I think, the sad news. I would say the encouraging news psychologically is over half of people report a different response to trauma, which is post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is the sense that, look, I wish this didn't happen. If I could, I would go back and undo it. But given that it happened, I feel like I am better in some way, having lived through it. It might be a heightened sense of personal strength. I got through that. I can get through almost anything. It could be a deeper sense of gratitude. Wow, I never appreciated how nice it was to be able to show up at work, or to be able to take a train, or to be able to go to a park. And, now I'm going to be thankful for those experiences in a way that I wasn't before. It could be finding new meaning or seeing new possibilities or, investing more in relationships with the people that, because we were so far apart from them, we now have become even closer to them emotionally. And I think we are going to see those kinds of changes unfold. We've probably already experienced some of them to date.
Presumably, there'll be some powerful insights for you to learn from this whole experience.
Yeah, I think there are going to be some incredible natural experiments that are, they're already being run. They're going to be analyzed. And we're going to be able to see, okay, what's the effect of having to work from home on productivity at a scale that's never been tested before. I think we're also going to learn something about what happens to people's creativity and connection when they can't interact face-to-face with their colleagues. And there's a whole group of organizational psychologists as well as sociologists and management professors who are going to probably spend the next 5-10 years studying the effects of this pandemic in different places. And yeah, I guess in a way that could be another form of post-traumatic growth, is we gain new insights about how to work together effectively from a distance that we wouldn't have had access to otherwise. And, I wish we didn't have access to it. I'd rather not go through this crisis. I would rather that no one had to face it. But given that we're stuck with it, we might as well try to learn from it.
Dr. Adam Grant, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
To get more from Adam Grant, subscribe to his podcast, Work Life with Adam Grant, and his newsletter, which already goes out to 100,000 people. You can find all that at adamgrant.net. I'm joined now by Linda Lucina in New York. How are you, Linda?
I'm good, Robin. How are you?
Not bad, thank you. Linda joins us every week to give a flavour of what we've been covering on our website, weforum.org. You've picked us 3 stories, Linda. Tell us about your pick this week.
All my picks this week have one theme, that we're not alone, and that we're connected in ways that we don't always think about. In the first, a psychologist wrote for us that the lockdowns billions of us are experiencing are actually the world's biggest psychological experiment. In a survey he conducted to understand changing stress levels, he found that we're mostly resilient, which is good news. But if you're starting to feel anxious or exhausted, you're not the only one. According to his research, your ability to cope changes, and some stress levels can increase as the weeks wear on. So know what you're experiencing is normal, and that others are experiencing it too.
That's by Dr. Elke van Hoof of the Free University of Brussels. Very interesting. Yeah, exhaustion, even if you're not doing very much, seems to be a fairly common thing. It also relates to the main part of our podcast this week, the Adam Grant interview, who talks about this whole thing being a massive psychological experiment. That story is called "Lockdown is the World's Biggest Psychological Experiment and We Will Pay the Price." It's on our website. Linda, what's your second story?
My second piece was written by the president of the International Longevity Center in Brazil, and it makes the point that the privileged are connected to the world's poorest in this crisis, and the virus has started to spread to emerging economies like Brazil, where tens of millions live hand to mouth. The author makes the point that there is no wall that the rich can build to block out the virus, and unless we can find ways to protect the world's most vulnerable populations, no one will truly be safe from coronavirus.
That one's called "Coronavirus Makes Inequality a Public Health Issue." It's written by Alexandra Kalesh, the president of the International Longevity Center in Brazil. Linda, what's your third story?
My third piece, by actually one of our colleagues, looks at a little discussed reality of disaster management, and that's the role that clubs and organizations play. And so with the scale of the pandemic, groups like church clubs will be even more important because they're localized and they're on the ground, and it can be some comfort to know that those groups are actually best poised to help in many ways, since they're efficient, they know their communities, they know what people need, and they aren't far away.
That one's called "Why Informal Networks Will Be Key to the COVID-19 Recovery." It's written by Muchka Heller of the World Economic Forum. That's just a flavour of the coverage you can find at weforum.org. Linda, thanks very much for your pick this week.
No, thanks so much, Robin.
That's about all from World vs. Virus this week. You can find all our coverage of COVID-19 at weforum.org and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube and on Twitter using the handle @WEF. Please subscribe to receive the podcast every week. Just search World vs. Virus on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or most other podcast platforms. Let's end on an up note. The Italian region of Lombardy has been one of the worst hit in the world so far by COVID-19. At the region's heart is the magnificent Milan Cathedral, the Duomo, where to mark Easter, with a message of hope for the people there and around the world, opera singer Andrea Bocelli performed this. He sang inside the Duomo, accompanied by the church organ, and outside, in the normally bustling piazza, completely alone. This is Andrea Bocelli's Amazing Grace.